This is a download for The Philosopher's Arms, pints and philosophical puzzles presented by Matthew Sweet.
Hello! Hello, and welcome to The Philosopher's Arms, the only pub in the country where you're considered too drunk to be served if you can't stand on one leg and say ontological epistemology. Each week we gather a rowdy bunch of philosophers, experts and barflies to debate a classic philosophical problem suggested by something that happened to me on the way to the pub. So, things were looking pretty good when I woke up this morning. I switched on the Today programme to hear that the public finances had gone into surplus, that thanks to the bankers' really generous decision to give a few months' profit to the Exchequer. So tuition fees will be abolished next week, and my local library is going to reopen. Great. Then the phone rang. It was Bono. Matthew, he said, "You're so right. We're awful, so we are. That's the last album you two will ever make." And then I opened a letter from the Booker Prize Committee saying that I'd been shortlisted. Brilliant. But then something odd happened. I had the feeling of two sticky pads falling from my temples, and I heard a voice coming from the radio. And now, thought for the day with Anne Atkins. And I looked out of the window and I saw that the library was still padlocked. What had happened? Well, my introductory hour on a new gadget called the Experience Machine was up. A little gizmo that offers you the perfect simulation of a fulfilled and happy life. I'm meeting the inventor, a guy named Mo, here tonight, and I must say I'm tempted to take up his offer and plug in permanently. If you think I should go for it, if you think I should live in this amazing world of socially responsible bankers and free higher education for all, then tap your glasses now. And if you think, no, give me frustration, give me the deficit, give me the rejection slip, then tap now. OK, so who tapped and consigned me to this life of frustration and misery? Madam, why are you going to do this to me? What's the argument for not plugging into this world of fulfilment?
Because, you have to deal with the hand you're given. Because the alternative is a cop-out.
Would you not do it then?
No, I wouldn't.
Who said that I or they should plug into it?
Yeah, I think that without religion, there's no need to be living in ultimate reality, and you may as well be living in the happiest way.
You would miss out on what could be argued to make you human, of guilt, sadness, and it wouldn't really be true life.
So it would be inauthentic in some way?
Yes, it would.
I think that the idea of pleasure is mostly based on us kind of guessing what it is that we want. By staying in the machine for your whole life, your only sort of experience of pleasure is what you've already experienced, and therefore you can't experience anything new.
What if it was like a holiday? What if you stayed in there for 6 months?
OK, in that case I'd say, yeah, go for it. You only live once and you may as well live in pleasure as far as you can.
Who else would take a holiday in this machine? Tap your glasses if you would take a holiday in the Experience Machine. Well, actually, that's quite a reasonably vocal response. I want to go over to our panel now and ask David Willits, the university's minister, one of the intellectual leaders of British conservatism. You're the party of choice. Would you make a choice to plug into this machine?
No, I wouldn't.
Why not?
I think it's a kind of suicide. I think it's opting out from reality into an alternative world where you don't have adversity, where you don't develop, as people have said, where you don't engage with physical reality. So it's the death of something very important in us. I think it would be a terrible thing.
What if it was a temporary suicide, though? A temporary retreat, if you could go into this world after, say, you'd just been dumped or had some unpleasant experience?
Even then, it would be a bit like taking a drug. I mean, it is kind of opting out, isn't it?
OK, well, we also have Joe Wolfe on our panel, the political philosopher. Joe, what's the problem underneath this problem? What am I really choosing between in philosophical terms?
The problem comes from the American political philosopher Robert Nozick, and it's in a section of his book Anarchy, State and Utopia, and the section is called The Experience Machine. And what he is doing there is trying to run an argument against the moral theory of utilitarianism. Because according to utilitarianism, at least classical utilitarianism, this is a theory of Bentham and Mill, the only thing that matters to us is pleasure or happiness. After all, the theory says we should maximize pleasure or happiness. Nozick wants to question whether this is the correct theory. That is, utilitarianism requires it to be true that the only thing that matters is pleasure. Nozick says, well, if that's right, then you should be quite prepared to plug into the experience machine. You'll get more pleasure from the experience machine than you could from anything else. And I think there is really a dilemma here. What is important to us, if not how things seem and feel?
So who else in the history of philosophy has countered this idea that subjective experience, subjective pleasure, let's say, is the most important element of it?
Well, this is what makes it a dilemma, because, of course, as many people have already indicated, there's another view of well-being, that what matters is really what happens to you rather than how things feel. And that the mere fact that things feel good isn't enough to make them good for you.
And how far back does that idea go?
Well, it goes back a long way. The ancient Greeks had this view. Aristotle thought there was an objective notion to happiness. He even went as far to say don't call a man happy until he's dead. That is, you need to look at his life as a whole to know whether he was happy or not, rather than looking just at the episodes in his life. You may not be the best judge of your own happiness. That it could well be that other people are in a better position to say whether you had a happy life than you yourself.
So a utilitarian would say that it would be better to be a happy failure than somebody who suffered in their life and then gained reputation posthumously. It would be better to be Salieri than Mozart. David Willits, would you rather be one of those politicians fated in their day but judged unkindly by history, or a politician unregarded in his lifetime, recognised as a prophet after his death?
Of course, it's possible to have the worst part of both options, as you know. I think that one of the differences between a politician and a statesman is precisely that the reason why people become statesmen is that they do things for the long term, and it's clear that what they did makes sense, even if it was not immediately popular at the time. I'm with what Jonathan said. I think that kind of Aristotelian idea is the crucial one. It's really about what makes life worthwhile and what makes life worth living, which isn't quite the same as just what makes you happy. And it may be that raising kids, discharging obligations within your family, having a job that you think is worthwhile, all those type of things, even if they don't immediately make you happy, they add up to something.
Joe, let's try and investigate a bit more about what intuitions and instincts underlie what the audience here was saying. You know, that this is an inauthentic experience, that you would be missing out on some negative things about life that actually might be very important. Who was it who raised the question of inauthenticity?
Well, in the experience machine, you could do anything. To have the happiness and the experience in there, you would have to not know that it was false.
Joe?
I think it's very important to distinguish not wanting to plug in because you don't think it's going to work out well in the end. People said I wouldn't plug in because eventually you'd have to deal with reality, because everything will eventually come crashing down. So that is actually a reason from perhaps subjective experience for not plugging in. The other type of reason is to say this is just the wrong type of way of living your life, and that somehow a life that's in contact with reality is a better one than one that's not in contact with reality, independently of what it does for your subjective well-being. So if your argument is, say, no, don't plug into the machine because it will work out badly, or don't take the drug because it will work out badly, you're actually conceding much more ground to the opponent than you would do if you say don't plug into the machine because that's the wrong sort of way of living your life.
Yes, sir, let's go to you.
Well, it seems to me this question is not so hypothetical after all, that we live in a world in which we are constantly in false utopias of consumer society and so on, and blind to the antagonisms which are constantly surrounding us. We live in denial of death, I think, for the most part, but also in denial of social antagonisms as well. The problem with all of this is that reality eventually comes crashing down, and when that happens, it will be completely traumatic and disastrous. So in that sense, it seems to me that we should say, we're already in this machine. How do we get out of it?
If you could choose to know whether or not your partner had had an affair in the past, or remain ignorant of it, it's all over, it's all in the past, it's not affecting the present day, would you choose to know it or not to know it?
ignorance is bliss, of course, who would choose the misery? But of course, the point I want to make is, at what cost comes bliss?
Joe, is ignorance bliss?
Well, it's a great question, and it's a question I used to ask people I was interviewing for a place at university. It's a recurring theme in Chekhov, for example, about whether it's better to know that everyone hates you or to go to your death thinking that everyone loves you. So what is the better thing for you, to know the truth or to be in blissful ignorance? I think it's a really hard question. I think anyone who thinks they know the answer to that is probably not thinking hard enough.
Yes, this is our philosophical Swede, Anders Skanberg, who is full of the deep thoughts for which his nation is justly famous.
And of course exiled for being too happy. But I think the problem of escaping the kind of experience machine we're already trapped in is very deep, because our brains are already producing a lot of our experience. 75% of the input to our visual cortex comes from the rest of the brain, not our eyes. And we're constructing all the time images of the world, both elaborate and simple, which probably our own experience machine. So we kind of self-generate our illusions. And if removing that, we would have to remove a large part of our brain.
Okay, right. Well, I think this is a very good moment to bring in our next panellist, Dr. David Geeney, who's a consultant psychiatrist and a lecturer at Oxford University. What has just been said in this room, I think, chimes in rather neatly with some of the thoughts that I know that you have on this.
Well, I think, as has been said before, we do have positive illusions, and we ordinarily tend to have an unreasonably favourable impression about ourselves, the world we inhabit, the environment around us. If you ask people what are they like as drivers, well, the majority of people will say, I'm better than average. Now, that can't be right.
So we're in this machine already then, to some extent?
We're in this machine already to some extent. But also, that machine is part of what makes us function well. And there was an interesting study that was done looking at marital couples. The more positive their illusions were about each other, the better their relationship was.
So if we had a machine that did the opposite of the experience machine, a machine that removed our rose-tinted spectacles, the pragmatron, let's call it, would we plug ourselves into that? Should we plug ourselves into that?
Well,
sounds like it would be dangerous.
Well, if you lose that positive cognitive bias, then you are vulnerable to depression. When we are in that state, we can then withdraw, deliberate about problems that we may be facing in our lives. The old truth of sadder but wiser.
So do we undervalue sadness and what it can do for us?
Well, I think we do, because we didn't evolve to be happy. We evolved to survive and to reproduce. And evolution was indifferent to the fact of whether we were suffering or not.
So why then do we see sadness as a kind of medical problem often? Is it over-pathologised?
My own view is that it has become over-pathologised. In fact, since the time of Hippocrates, Western physicians, up until the late 20th century, would differentiate between what they considered a depressive disorder and normal sadness as occurring as a consequence of real problems in an individual's life. But then in the 1980s, the diagnostic criteria for depression changed, and context was removed. So now, if you're suffering from severe symptoms of sadness, with the one exception of bereavement, you can be diagnosed as suffering from a depressive disorder. If we plug into the medication too easily, if we get used to medicalising normal sadness, I think there's a danger that we may fail to notice what there is in the world around us that may be contributing to our sadness, the sort of real social